So I got the reading up this morning a little bit later than I intended, but I couldn't get access to the paper. So it's down here, week 10 reading. I don't know why I did the 10. I guess it should be week 9. I'll edit that. Also, should this afternoon be getting up that first, or not the first, the next homework assignment. So we can kind of start chipping away at that. We haven't covered that much material yet, so you won't be able to do a whole lot, but it'll just be sitting there as we kind of cover things. So we were talking about the labor market last class, and we're going to kind of continue to analyze that. So we were looking at differences like small, large market teams, and really, just as a kind of reminder, a lot of the things that we're going to be analyzing hinge on this idea that the demand for labor is going to be the value of the marginal product of labor. In our context, right, so usually this is the price of a good times the marginal productivity of the worker. So how many units will the worker add times whatever I can sell the units for. For us, it's going to look a little bit different because the price we're thinking about is really the amount of revenue generated from each additional win that a player brings to my team. So we kind of talked about this, larger markets might have a higher margin revenue per win. We think about different quality players, right? Lower quality players have lower marginal wins added. So they're going to have a slightly lower demand curve. And then we can kind of look at what compare the equilibrium wages. Okay? So I'm going to kind of I'll come back to this here in a second. So if we think about why might teams, or why might players, or what's the benefit to both, invest in their players, right? So maybe, you could think about the basic example of this is, I send my players to the minor leagues, right? Or I hire coaches that I think can improve this player's chance, like a quarterback's coach to help out this quarterback, right? Why am I making those investments, right? Because those investments will have a cost, right? Well, to just run a minor league team, you have to pay these different coaches. I'm going to have some cost C, right? However, what we're assuming is, right, that I'm going to, get some return on investment down the road, that investing in this player's skill level will lead to them having higher marginal productivity or adding a higher number of additional wins to my team down the road. So I'm paying this cost. I'm hopefully increasing the marginal productivity of that worker. Well, what might be the problem if that worker's marginal productivity increases or the marginal wins added increases? What would that predict? So I've got the labor market here. And here's the player's original demand curve. We'll call this 1, and here's their supply curve. Right? After I invest in them, what's going to happen to that demand curve? Well, the player's marginal wins they're going to add goes up, right? Hopefully, if this skill investment actually paid off, which means my demand curve is going to increase, which would predict that I'm going to get a higher wage, right? Or have to pay that player a higher wage. In fact, even if that quantity of labor stays the same, you can think about it this way. Even if I wanted to continue at the same quantity of labor as before, I would now have to pay, or this player would be worth a much larger amount to teams. Right? So it's just a different way of thinking about it, right? If I was fixing the quantity of labor, so something like, I'm guaranteeing I'm getting the exact same quality of labor hours from that person, I would have to pay them a higher wage because they're bringing in more value now. Right? They're bringing in a higher number of additional wins, and so they're bringing in a higher number of additional revenue. So the problem with this skill investment is as soon as I invest in this player, I'm going to have to pay them higher wages. Well, now, if we have a free and open labor market and I'm paying them, the new wage is exactly equal to how much, and I shouldn't be writing this, sorry. I'm not squaring it, so I should use subscripts here. If these are the exact same, like if I have to renegotiate my contract, well, I'm no better off, right? Because before, I was also paying exactly what the player was worth, right? It's just now I've incurred this additional cost C, right? Now, if I don't have to renegotiate the contract, well, now I am better off. So think about it this way. Let's say I've got this player locked into a 10-year contract, right? I invest a bunch of money in their first couple years, right? And it really improves their marginal wins, right? It really improves the quality of that player. Well, now, what is that player going to be worth to me? Well, now W2, if I don't have to renegotiate the contract, that's what I would be willing to pay them, but I'm still only paying them W1, right? So you can kind of think about it as, I guess the real advantage would be, this is how much the player is now bringing into my team, but I'm still paying them those old wages. So as long as this difference is greater than my costs, oh, sorry, you guys should have said something. I was writing off that. Stop me next time before I get started. So I'll go through that a little bit more. So the original wage, right? I was paying the player exactly what they're worth. Perfectly competitive market. After this skill investment, if I had a free and open labor market and I had to renegotiate the contract, I'm no better off. I'm paying exactly what the player is bringing in. It's just now I've incurred this additional cost. So I'd actually be worse off if I had to renegotiate contracts annually. It wouldn't make sense to invest in players. It kind of makes sense. Like, think about you as like a worker or just in more general context. Why am I going to dump a bunch of money into you if I know that you switch jobs every couple months? Right? I'm never going to get the long-term benefits of you now having this new skill. Same idea here. If I have to keep renegotiating contracts year after year with you, I'm not guaranteed you're going to stay, right? And so if I invest a bunch into you, I might just be eating that cost, and now another team kind of hires you, right? So if I don't have to renegotiate contracts, this is why teams love long contracts. Well, one of the reasons. But if I think that you're only going to get better, and I lock you in now for this lower wage, and then in the future, the value that you bring into my team goes up because your quality is going up, well, now I'm better off. As long as that difference, right, like my net positive gain there is greater than the cost that it took me to put into your original skill level. I would argue, like for the minor leagues, like that cost is relatively insignificant, right? In terms of the actual additional value that you would bring into the team once they're on the professional league, if you lock them into this lower wage. So you see in like a really good example that also is like if you bring players over from like a lot of times like other countries like Cuba, Dominican Republic, like they'll lock them into these contracts, right, before they're like these superstars, and then by the time they're doing well, they're grossly underpaying them. Now they're still investing a lot into that player, right? They're taking a risk. They got minor leagues, they're investing in coaches to help them out, but they're expecting that they have these huge gains in the future from that player improving in quality. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? So, might be one problem, right? We have to renegotiate every year. I'm just going to end up paying you a higher wage, and now I'm just out whatever it costs me to invest in you. But if we have long contracts, it could be good. So it's unlikely that I'm going to get teams, especially if contracts aren't very long, they're really being invested in general skills, right? So kind of what I was assuming on this skill acquisition is that whatever improvement the player sees, he's going to have that improvement, or he or she is going to have that improvement on no matter what team they're on, right? But there could be some team-specific, like investment, right? Or some team-specific skill investment, sorry. So let's say that I've got a player and they learn a specific type of offensive scheme when they're on team A, right? If that's skill, learning that system or learning that style of offense is specific to just that team, I don't know. Maybe we'll use the Baltimore Ravens, right? They've invested in the market. He has talent that's specific to their offensive scheme, may not carry over to other teams, for a hypothetical example. So what's going to happen? Well, we've got two, so we'll just kind of call it team A and team B. You can make it more complicated and do like every other team in the league, but we'll just think about this kind of as like Ravens, non-Ravens, right? So we've got, let's assume that the supply of labor, that this person has no preferences, no matter what team they end on, they'd supply the exact same amount of labor at these different wage levels. You then have my demand for labor, and let's say this is from well, this is team B that I'm not currently on. And this is the demand for team A. So let's say we have the exact same demand curves, right? We're starting out exact same demand curves. Okay? Team A and team B. Can identify our equilibrium points, right? If I've got skill-specific investment, right, such that the marginal wins coming from this labor, now remember, my demand curve for labor is marginal revenue per win times marginal wins coming from labor. If it's team-specific skill investment, then the marginal wins coming from that labor is going to improve for team A, the team making the investment. So we'll call this A invest, right, after they invested. Okay. But on team B, they're not going to see any change in their skill level. This offensive scheme doesn't apply to these other teams in the league. So their demand curve is going to stay the same. So now we get that the worth of the player, actually, sorry, let me do switching numbers. Here's A, and then this is team B, right? So team A, after the skill acquisitions, the player's better than on that team, they'd be willing to pay them up to that W-2 wage. Every other team only values that player at this amount. Right? We're going to see that for other teams, they're not willing to pay this higher wage. Right? So if I'm the only team, I have team-specific investment or skill investment, and however I improved you, like this offensive scheme only applies to my team. Why is that a good thing here? Will I end up paying that high wage? What wage would I actually pay the player? Infinitesimally just above WB, right? Above that wage that the other team's willing to pay. So if I can get some team-specific skill investment, it really benefits because I don't have to pay the player very much more, right? I know that if there's no other team where that skill is going to improve their quality, I can actually get away with paying them just above whatever the other teams would, right? And if I do that, remember, like, even if I think about it, the same quantity of labor, that value, the demand curve for labor represents the value that player is bringing into the team or the additional revenue that their additional wins is bringing in. That's going to be significantly above the wage that they can pay them. But that's only if it's team specific, right? And we could complicate this where like, well, maybe it's, it improves my quality for team A a lot, but improves my quality a little bit for other teams. And so, I have to pay them a little bit more money than kind of in this example. But if it's 100% team specific, we actually have teams benefiting a lot. So teams are always going to prefer, and it kind of makes sense. Teams are always going to prefer team specific, right, investments or team specific skills investment as opposed to general skills investment. So we kind of already talked about this, but just in the context of the model. Really, the player can't threaten to leave. I mean, I'll use the Lamar thing. I think it's just because it's relevant, but like, if his value to the Ravens really is this high, but his value to every other team is down here, I mean, he can threaten to leave all he wants, but there's not going to be another team who's willing to give him any wage above WB, right? And so I don't know if that's exactly what's happening. I'm sure his skills would transfer to other teams a little bit, right? But the idea is that player might be bringing in an insanely high value to that team, but if there's no other team that they would bring in the same amount to, well, then I can see a way we can, paying those lower wages. Yeah.
As the Ravens really kind of called his bluff too when they tagged him, so they're allowed to offer anything that any other team offers them.
Yeah, so I'm going a little bit to the side here, but let's say this is good. I created it. So let's say I don't know where your value to other teams is. Right? I really know your value to my team. I've got all the numbers and house everything. So I don't know if it's right here. Like, I don't know if I could get away with paying you this low of a wage. I don't know if it's right here. I get away with paying you this low of a wage. So what I might do is, if I just let you another team make you an offer, and then I'm going to match it. Every other team's going to make you an offer. I'm going to match it. Even if the man's up here, I'm going to match it. I'm still better off, right? Until there's a team that has demand higher than me, I'm always going to be able to pay you a lower wage than what I would actually be willing to if there was another competitor who you had the exact same brought the exact same amount of additional revenue to. Any questions on this before we keep moving? All right, so it's skill acquisition. I think I'm going to skip around a little bit. I don't really want to do this for right now, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit. All right, I'll do a little bit of review of this. We talked about this stuff before the exam, so just as kind of a reminder, when we had monopsony power, right? We said generally that's going to look something like this, where there's only one employer. They make decisions based off of marginal expenditures, which is going to be twice as steep as my supply curve. So I now, whereas my marginal expenditure hit my demand curve, kind of this lower quantity than before. We'll call this perfectly competitive. And the wage without the monopsony is right here. Even though I'm choosing this quantity, I know that workers or players would be willing to play for this low of a wage, right? So with a monopsonist, I can actually get away with paying slightly lower wages, right? So that was our kind of monopsony model. We said that's going to drive wages of players down. What's one way we can combat that? I'll draw these on separate graphs. You can put them all on the same, you could have them on the same one, but if we don't have, or sorry, so here we have monopsony power, right? What's one way we can combat that and get wages to be higher? Well, if players come together and say, look, we're the only, you can only hire someone if they're in the players union, right? So they kind of have a little bit more power. There's really only one supplier of labor in these professional sport leagues. So they're a monopolist, right? Not a monopsonist, right? That was one consumer, right? One employer there. But if we have one producer of a good, that's a monopolist. Here, the good is labor. So the only people producing labor is the union, right? So they're going to make a decision based off this twice as steep marginal revenue curve, where marginal revenue hits supply. Right? This will be kind of their quantity that they choose. And they know that, teams would be willing to pay wherever we're at in our demand curve, right? The demand curve told us the value of that player to that team. So we know that teams would be willing to pay this higher wage relative to this point of perfect competition. Right? Just kind of a quick review. And I don't know whether today, but eventually we'll maybe start putting some equations for these monopsony models so where we can solve for these quantities and solve for these wages, right? But for right now, we just need to know that monopsonist, I guess if this might help to label these, right? Our monopsonist is going to drive wages down, and our monopolist, which is how the union acts, right? It's going to drive wages up. So in practice, we're going to have some negotiating and bargaining, right? But we're going to be somewhere in between these two new wages. So let's go back. Actually, did everybody get this? Take this one. So, oops. Let's think about some other things that might change. We might use this idea of a monopolist or kind of a monopsonist here. So let's say we have rival leagues. So you go back, you have one employer of labor. There's only one league that, pays professional football players in the US. So what happens if there's a rival? How could it lead to higher wages? And how could it lead to lower wages? Right? Well, potentially, right? If we have a rival league, there's no longer one employer. I can go work for one. So PGA and so Live right now, right? You've now got a competing league. Right. And so you no longer have monopsony power. So what should that do to earnings or wages? Well, if we eliminate monopsonist power by having a rival league, we should expect wages to go up. Right? Also having a rival league, though, means that I might now have like two different players unions. So I can hire from this union or I can hire from this other union. Right? There's now 2 leagues. So, excuse me, the players don't have as much control as before, or they're losing some of their monopolist power, right? Or some of their union power, and we might actually see wages kind of go down, right? So we've got things working in opposite directions, but what we know is that if I eliminate monopolist power of the rival league, that's going to push my wages kind of up. If I eliminate the monopolist power, that's going to kind of have the force of pushing that wage down, right? So which one's going to be more? Depends on, how much monopoly power versus how much union power is lost, right? So it's really kind of uncertain. Right? But just using this idea of what we talked about with a monopolist and unions before. Okay. So just wanted to revisit that. We already looked at all this. So the models that I'm showing you are what we would call, I believe those are craft unions. Or no, sorry, that's an industrial union. So the industrial union acts like a monopolist. Craft union, they're just setting quantity, right? It's going to have the same effect. So I was drawing this, monopoly or this union power model was like they were acting like an industrial union. A craft union, instead of like basing this off of the twice as steep marginal revenue curve, they might just come in and set a quantity of people they're willing to accept in their union, right? So I'm only going to accept this many people. There's only going to be this fixed supply. If this is the fixed supply, I know that teams will be willing to pay this higher wage. You would still end up with the same monopolist or union wage. It's just operating through setting quantity as opposed to kind of setting the wage initially. So it's not, the outcome is the same, right? It just acts in a slightly different mechanism. We'll keep going here. So let's try to do, I couldn't remember where I had this at. Let's try to do some monopoly or monopolist for union examples, but with an actual equation for our demand and supply curve. Okay? So I've got my demand curve for labor looks something like this, and my supply curve for labor looks something like this. So let me write these down before we go to before I start doing this, so I don't have to keep going back and forth. So we've got demand is 60,000 minus 4Q, and supply is what, 10,000 plus Q. Okay. So we'll just work through this model and we'll come back to this slide. All right. So I've got my two equations for labor supply and labor demand. So I know that demand is going to start out at 60,000. And it's going to decrease as I increase quantity. If I wanted to, I could figure out what quantity it hits the x-axis at. That's not necessarily going to be useful in anything we're going to do. But if I really wanted to like plot this out perfectly, I could set the wage equal to 0 and figure out what that quantity is. Right? My supply curve is going to start at 10,000 and then increase. Right? So what is this equilibrium point going to be? Without a union, what would the wage that players are going to earn be? Right? Well, I'll first figure out what that quantity is, and then I can back out what that perfectly competitive wage is. Right? So all I'm going to do is set my supply and demand curves equal to each other. Right? So what, 60,000 minus 4Q is equal to 10,000 plus Q. Rearrange things a little bit. I get 50,000 is equal to 5Q. Divide both sides by 5. Get what, 10,000? I'm looking at this right. Is everyone clear how I did that? So all I did was set my supply and demand equations equal to each other and then solve for that quantity. Once I have that quantity, how do I figure out what the equilibrium wage is? I can plug it back into either one of these supply and demand curves, right? So I plug it in here, 60,000 minus 4 times 10,000, right? So gives me this equilibrium wage of 20,000. If I plug it into supply, 10,000 plus 10,000 would give me that same equilibrium wage of 20,000. So I first find my quantity, I then plug it back into either my supply or demand curve. That'll tell me the perfectly competitive wage. It's a little bit trickier if I'm looking at a union wage, because now I've got this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So my marginal revenue equation is going to be, well, it starts at the same point as demand, but it's twice as steep, right? So it starts out at the same point as my demand curve, but it's twice as steep. Now I figure out, where does my marginal revenue curve equal my supply curve, right? It's a little bit of algebra here. I get what? 50,000 divided by 9. So I don't know what that works out to. What? Thank you. So 5, 5, 5, 5. All right. So I got about 5,555 here. What's my corresponding wage going to be? Well, this is not where I can't just simply go back in and plug it into either supply or demand, because if I plug it into supply, that's going to tell me the lowest wage workers would work for, but they've got the union power, so they're able to charge or get a wage that's up here on the demand curve, however much the teams value that player. So I'll take that quantity, figure out where I'm at on the demand curve. I'm simply going to plug it in my demand curve, right? So 60,000 minus 4 times 5,555. I'm guessing it's somewhere below 40,000, but close to it. Can't do that math exactly in my head, but it's going to be just a little bit under 400,000, I think. Or sorry, 40,000. So here, when I have union power, once I find that quantity, I need to make sure that I'm plugging that quantity back into my demand curve to find what the corresponding wage should be. Okay. Questions on that before we keep moving here? All right. So I think I've got everything. Oh, I guess I can show you. So I've got the quantities here. I've got wages, yeah. So just below 37,000. You could also do a craft union. So I can kind of show you how you would work through that one here. So one thing that I calculated on the slides that we didn't just discuss is finding deadweight loss. So here, deadweight loss is going to be the surplus lost out on by this reduction in the number of workers, or the reduction in the quantity of labor. So really, it would just be this entire triangle. Well, I've already got where that triangle starts. I could figure out where it stops here in terms of the height by just plugging in this quantity into my supply curve. I then have my old perfectly competitive quantity of 10,000, my union quantity of 5,555, base times height times 1/2. I could find what that deadweight loss area is. Now, the other way that this could have worked, so this is like an industrial union. We could have had a craft union, and I'll kind of show you what that would look like. So just drawing this out real quick again, so we don't have it all in the same graph. So with a craft union, maybe they just come in and say, look, we're going to set the quantity at 5,000. Right? We know that at that quantity, the amount that the teams would willing to pay would be up here, right? So with a craft union, you know what the quantity is going to be. That's the only number of workers that they're taking. So then it's just a matter of plugging into my demand curve that quantity that I'm selecting, right? So 60,000 minus 4, so this is what? This one is exactly 40,000, right? So the craft union, you really don't have to find the quantity first because you're just told the quantity, right? You know the number of members in that union, right? But it would, you would still find the wage the same way by plugging that quantity back into the demand curve. Okay. Questions there before we keep going? All right. So let's skip ahead a little bit here. I think we'll save this. Well, go through this. We start the discussion today. So I don't think we'll quite get there today. Maybe on Friday for sure. But if I've got the players union who wants higher wages, but I also have some monotonous power for my teams, which would lower the wage, where do we arrive in the middle? Where we have to do some negotiating. So in negotiating, we can have a couple different things happen, which are strikes or lockouts, right? So strikes are, hopefully, we think of when workers are striking. So the players are the ones who are going to initiate a strike, or the players union would say, we're not getting what we want. We're going to go on strike until we get it. A lockout is when the teams aren't getting what they want. And so they say, we're no longer going to have any games until the players union agrees to X, Y, and Z. Okay? So we've got either one of these can kind of stop production or stop games being played. Because, and why does this happen? Because we have kind of this bilateral monopoly, right? So we've got a monopolist in the product market, which makes them a monopsonist in the labor market. And then we have the union that has some monopoly power as well. So we're going to have both things going on at the same time. So we don't know exactly where the wage is going to fall, but we know kind of the range that it's going to be in, right? So I gave you more of a rudimentary kind of thing. It means like we're thinking about just wages. You could complicate it by not just putting wages in there, but other things that would impact the utility of these players. So maybe it's, locker room conditions or, X, Y, that you can't, I don't know, not a certain percent of the contract has to be guaranteed or something like that, right? These things that the union would like, right? So it doesn't just have to be wages. It could be rookie minimums. It could be that, you can't expect players to work a certain number of hours, right? Or they'll have to be the facility under a certain amount of hours, something like that. So they're not just going to be fighting for wages, they're going to be fighting for all these things. And generally they're kind of a mix of the two, right? They're trying to set the membership, right? They're trying to impact roster sizes, right? So they are kind of acting like a craft union, but they're also acting a little bit like an industrial union as well, trying to figure out where's that point that's optimal, where's that marginal revenue curve, hit the supply curve. So I already said all this. So they're unique in a couple other different ways, which is even if it's not pay, we can bargain for these other things, right? These other things that players want that aren't just wage. That's something I was going to say. No, I lost it. Oh, so you could do a model where maybe it's not wages that the union's fighting for. Maybe this is like the number of preseason games, right? So players generally, the players union at least, has kind of said they would rather have, fewer preseason games. Either they don't, half the players that are starters don't play and, they risk of getting injured. So there's going to be some, actually, this is think about this as a quantity of preseason games and kind of the dollar amount associated with them, right? So I've got some supply curve, right? The players are willing to play a certain number of preseason games for various amounts of money, right? If you give me enough money, yeah, I'll play 10 preseason games, right? There's going to be some demand that the league has, right? Because, yeah, it's not the marginal revenue per win in the regular season, but there is marginal revenue that's earned from just playing these preseason games, right? So what might be the case is, maybe the equilibrium where they arrive at is, I don't know, 4 preseason games, right? However, if I have a players union, right, and they know how much revenue that the teams are making, they can say, look, we'll make our decision based off this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. I'm going to choose a slightly lower number of preseason games. And I actually know that at that lower number, I could get away with the teams actually increasing the amount of money they're giving me for each preseason game. Now, that may not be as much as before. You can kind of imagine so we'll call this perfectly competitive, synopsis, 3 times, maybe the wage only goes up by 5,000. So, the wage per game is 5,000. So that'd be like what, 15,000. Whereas before at a quantity of 4 games, even if the wage was a little bit lower, so let's say it was 4,000, 4 times 4,000 would be 16,000, right? So I might not be better off in terms of the total amount of money earned, but the money I would be getting per game would go up. And I would see a reduction in preseason games if the union, does have an interest in kind of altering this, right? If the players that come together and we get some of that monopoly power. So it doesn't necessarily have to be wages and like the number of labor hours. You could think about this as the number of preseason games. You could think about the number of practices that you have to attend, the number of, whatever the different rules and regulations are of the various sports. Does this make sense? Any questions on this? Okay with this for now. All right, so there we go. Just going through some like setups. So we'll talk a little bit more. I don't want to go too in depth into all the different leagues because it all operates a little bit differently. But we're thinking about whether or not we have some monopsony power. Sometimes that's eliminated by things like free agency, right? Before, when they had the reserve clause, you couldn't leave the team unless you're traded. You still really, unless you're traded, you're under contract, right? But once your contract's up, we have this free agency where teams can, all compete for the same player. So the first league that actually had free agency was the NFL. I think so it was a free agency, but I think the NFL was the one where like all the owners kind of colluded and just acted like there wasn't a free agency, so it might as well have had the reserve clause. But they were technically the ones that first had it. They then imposed a rule, and a couple years later, that what was this? That you had to give up some compensation for signing these free agents. So, there's an additional cost to it. So it's still trying to they're trying to downplay this idea of free agency. And the whole reason why is because if we have free agency, as opposed to having more control over the players' rights, what does that give the teams more of? So if they have more of the rights to the player, there's less free agency options. They're going to have more monopsony power. What did monopsony power do? Well, we said that kind of allowed teams to pay a little bit lower wages. So the teams love this, right? The teams don't like free agency. They want to try to fight against it. And then really we didn't have this additional cost wasn't even eliminated until 1992, where there was free agency, but you had to give up, you had to give up a player if you sign a free agent. NHL, NBA, nothing too crazy. I mean, there's been competing leagues, so you got kind of free agency to move between leagues, although none of them really were at the same level. Although if you go back far enough, the ABA and the NBA, they really were rival leagues at one point. There was a lot of competition, so wages were pretty close to the equilibrium. They joined together, became more of a monopsonist, right? The only professional league. Once I have monopsony power, I can lower my wages a little bit. So anytime we see these competing leagues pop up, we generally see like if it's successful, they'll just merge, right? American National League in baseball, ABA, NBA, and basketball, right? Because that makes sense to have that monopsony power. You can get away with paying your players less. Okay. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say. That a merger. Oh, so why does the players union not want a merger? It's the exact opposite incentives, right? So why would the players union actually love it if the American National League, baseball operated completely independently? Well, because now there is increased competition. The league no longer has monopsony power, and wages should go up. Right? So we have the players who actively, want free agency. We have the teams who actively don't want it, and the reason why is because it's kind of free agency is stripping the league of monopsony power, whereas if you don't have free agency, it's kind of giving them more monopsony power. And then in Major League Baseball, story's a little bit more interesting, but Marvin Miller was kind of this guy who, saw this need. I forget what he did before he came into baseball, but he basically came in and created or helped create the players union. He recognized that these players were with the reserve clause being paid a lot less than what they should be. He got the players together, formed the union, and then kind of 1976 had a landmark case where free agency was kind of possible every year after that. So we kind of already talked about this a little bit, so I'm glad we're getting to it again. We're getting to it now. But this idea of some leagues have restricted and unrestricted free agency, right? So I think it operates a little bit differently in different professional leagues, but like in the NFL, you can think about like the restricted free agency means that you can go out and talk to other teams and you can potentially sign a deal with them, but often the team that currently has you under contract or currently has the kind of rights to negotiate with you has the ability to like match these other teams' offers, right? Unrestricted means that you can go sign an offer with anybody. The team doesn't get a chance to match it, right? So why might we like this? Well, we kind of already talked about, with unrestricted free agency, a player is going to sign with any team. This is just general what we think of a free agency, right? I can go make negotiate a contract with any team, right? I think, and then different leagues, right? This occurs at different points. So why might you not be able to be a unrestricted free agent your first four years, 6 years in Major League Baseball? Why do you think they're setting a number of years that you can minimum have to be in the league before you can become an unrestricted free agent? So what would this allow teams to do a little bit better of a job? If you can't be an unrestricted free agent until 4 years, so you're under contract with whatever team you started out with, what's that going to let them get away with doing? Well, let's say that team A is here. Here's your supply curve for labor, right? We're just going to look at the wage for a second. So this is the wage for team A. If there's other teams out there, so let's say I'm team A, I get this guy in the draft, I sign him to a 4-year contract, or sign him to a rookie deal. So for the first 4 years, nobody else can negotiate a contract with them. All right. So if there's other teams out there that would be willing to pay higher wages, right? Maybe team B is like a large market team. Team A is more like a small market team. Well, if you can't be an unrestricted free agent, you aren't allowed to go negotiate with team B. Team A is essentially, it's going to be easier for them to keep, right? They don't have to pay you the higher wages because they know no other team can even negotiate with you. So you're kind of, they're kind of stuck with whatever you're paying them. So unrestricted free agency would then allow you to negotiate with these other teams, maybe larger market teams, meaning that more of the players are going to go to the large market teams. We know that because the marginal revenue per win is higher, making competitive balance worse. These kind of minimums where you can't become an unrestricted free agent until this number of years is trying to kind of fight against this idea that, well, if you could just make it, negotiate with any team, we'd see more of our high quality players going to these larger markets. So this is another way of another rule where they're trying to improve competitive balance. And then hockey's is like really, I don't know, complicated. It's like ages and experience and varies by position. So it's not, I don't know, it's not worth delving into, but they do have forms of unrestricted free agency as well. If we had instead, we kind of already went through this model, but if we had restricted free agency, right? Why is this, I shouldn't say ultimately doesn't matter, but let's assume, so actually we already had it drawn out earlier. Oh, I messed that one up. So if we have restricted free agency, that gives the current team the right of refusal, right? So let's say that you're currently under, the Lamar situation, they gave him what, 30-some million for this first year. Let's say another team, he's restricted free agent right now. They come in and they say, okay, look, we actually be willing to pay a higher wage. So we've got this idea that here's team A, or we can think about this as the Ravens. And maybe they'd be willing to pay a much higher wage than they currently are, right? But if their belief is that someone, nobody else in the league has as high of a demand for that player, right? So they know no other team will be willing to pay them a higher wage. They can get away with kind of cutting the wage to be just infinitesimally above whatever those other teams are, right? So the restricted free agency, team B comes into the Lamar and says, look, we'll give you, I don't know, $200 million guaranteed. The Ravens are like, well, we've been holding out, but we're willing to give you 220. Okay, they refused. The Ravens say we can match that offer. We'll actually go higher, and so he ends up, playing for that higher wage. In fact, it's unlikely the Ravens do pay him 220. They probably look at that offer and say, okay, well, if the highest team was willing to pay you 200 million, I'll match that, right? So I can get away, and that's kind of this restricted free agency is if I can match that offer, you stay put, right? So if every other team has lower demand than me, then making you a restricted free agent makes sense, right? Because I'm going to allow these teams to give you offers. I'm just going to match them. And if no other team has a demand higher than I do for you, I'm going to actually end up paying you a wage that's below your value to my team. I'm actually going to have a net benefit.
So if the deal gets matched, do they have to stay with the team on the rights?
I believe in NFL, at least that's the way it works, is that it's, you can sit out, but as long as they match it, another team makes an offer and the current team matches it, and that player stays with the team.
It's because of that tag that they put on them.
Yeah, and the teams have a choice, right? So the reason why I might not have wanted to make him an unrestricted free agent is I must think that he has higher value. I just am not really sure where I want to pay him, right? But with a restricted free agency, I can get a really good idea about what the market is and still have that option of keeping the player on my team, right? Matching that offer. Now, where would this break down? Let's say there is a team. I don't know what team it would be, but the Commanders or whatever, right? And they do have higher demand, right? Maybe that was a bad example. So let's think of what's a success. This won't happen, but this would be a really good idea. Let's say that Dak Prescott breaks his leg tomorrow, right? And the Cowboys don't have a quarterback. Well, they generate a lot of additional revenue per win relative, probably even to Baltimore. He would, add a lot of wins to that team. They might have a really high demand curve for them if they lose their starting quarterback, right? And so, if you're a restricted free agent, it's kind of like the invariance principle. If there is somebody out there that values you more, who would be willing to pay you this higher wage, well, Baltimore says, yeah, I'm not going to match that, right? This is at most, how much you're worth to my team. I'm willing to pay you up to that wage. There's another team offering you a higher wage. I'm just not going to match the offer. Then you end up on the team that values the most. Is that? Let me take questions on that idea. So I'll complicate this a little more. Let's say, because it's a relevant example. So let's say there is a team out there. It doesn't matter which one, that does have a higher demand for that player's labor, right? They'd be willing to pay a higher wage. The way, at least my understanding, I think even under the restricted free agency is, and if anyone knows stuff out of the head, what do you have to do if you, what is it? If someone else signs and there's compensatory picks, right?
So if he signs with another team, you have to give the Ravens your first round pick this year and first round pick.
Yeah, so if they don't match it, right? So let's say we're in this scenario. There's a team offers Lamar a higher wage, so he's not going to stay with the Ravens. If he goes to this other team, that team has to give the Ravens compensatory picks. I think it's two first rounds. So what is that really doing? That's adding a cost to acquiring that player. So remember, we had our demand curve for labor. I should probably keep the color the same. It will now be, whatever the marginal revenue per wins times marginal wins per labor. This is the value of the player to the team. But if now acquiring him also means that I have to incur this additional cost, which is losing my 2 first-round picks. So whatever I value those 2 first-round picks at, I'm going to see a reduction in that demand curve. So potentially there is a team out there. So you can think about this with minus that cost. There might be a team out there that values that player more, might value Lamar Jackson more than the Ravens. But if they also have to give him a wage and then give up picks, which has an additional cost, it may mean that there is no wage that they would offer that could, the Ravens wouldn't match. Right? So I don't know. We'll see how this plays out. But these are the principles kind of behind what's going on. We can kind of think about these restricted, unrestricted free agents. So we'll pick up on this next class and also kind of look at contract zone stuff.